Welcome back, Deep Divers. We're diving into a fascinating topic today from the world of education,
Hmm.
educational psychology. We're going to be talking about the big fish, little pond effect.
The BFLPE.
Right, the BFLPE. But we'll unpack that acronym in a minute. Now, I bet some of you are already tilting your heads thinking, what is this big fish, little pond business? And I don't blame you. It sounds a little, well, fishy at first. It's this idea that being in a super competitive academic environment, like a school for gifted kids, well, it might actually make students feel less confident about their smarts compared to equally bright kids in more average settings. It's kind of
It
counterintuitive.
really is. You'd naturally think that surrounding yourself with high achievers would boost everyone's confidence, a rising tide lifts all boats kind of thing. But that's not what the research shows.
Yeah, and we're not talking about just a handful of studies here. This big fish, little pond effect, we'll just call it the BFLPE from now on, is backed by a mountain of research.
It is, absolutely. You've got studies looking at students across different grades, different subjects, different countries even.
Yeah.
And then you've got these huge international assessments like PIFE, the Program for International Student Assessment.
Which involve literally hundreds of thousands of students.
Exactly, from all over the world. And the BFLPE keeps popping up in these studies consistently. It's a pretty robust effect.
So that's what we're going to try to unpack today. Does the BFLPE affect everyone in the same way? Are there certain students who are more or less likely to experience it? We're going to focus specifically on motivation. Does a student's motivation, like how they set their goals or how they approach learning, change the way the BFLPE works for them?
Right, because some researchers have proposed that these individual factors might act as moderators. They could either make the BFLPE stronger or maybe weaken it.
Exactly. And to dig into this, we're going to be looking at a really interesting research article.
It was a very long title.
Yeah, get ready for this one. Moderation of the big fish, little pond effect. Juxtaposition of evolutionary, Darwinian, economic, and achievement motivation theory predictions based on a Delphi approach.
Catchy.
Oh, yeah, rolls right off the tongue. But seriously, the way they did this research is fascinating. They used a Delphi approach where they gathered a bunch of experts and had them systematically make predictions.
Like a think tank for the BFLPE.
Exactly. So, our mission today is to break down this BFLPE for you, explore whether different flavors of motivation act like a dimmer switch on this effect, and then we're going to step back and look at the bigger picture. And get this, the implications connect to some really interesting ideas from, wait for it, Darwinian economics.
Evolution and economics. That's an interesting combo.
It is, right. But we'll get to that later. Okay, let's zoom in on this BFLPE a bit more. So, the core idea is that a really bright, capable student might feel, less competent academically in a classroom where everyone's a high achiever compared to a classroom with a wider range of abilities. And this can happen even if their grades, their actual performance is exactly the same in both situations.
Yeah, and the reason that happens is because of how we, as humans, naturally compare ourselves to others. It's this thing called social comparison.
We're always sizing each other up.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And our academic self-concept, which is basically how we perceive our own academic abilities, is heavily influenced by these comparisons. So imagine you're in a really selective school or classroom. Everyone around you is super smart, getting good grades, you're doing well objectively, but you're constantly comparing yourself to these other high achievers. And that can lead to you undervaluing your own skills and abilities.
Even if you're actually doing great, you're essentially moving the goalposts without realizing it.
Right, because the benchmark, the frame of reference, has shifted upwards.
So it's like this weird paradox. You'd think being in a high-powered environment would boost everyone's confidence, but the BFLPE tells a different story. Now, you mentioned that this isn't just limited to a few specific cases. It's actually a very widespread phenomenon, right?
Oh, absolutely. Marsh and Seaton, they did a massive review of the research on the BFLPE, and they looked at studies from tons of different countries. And the conclusion was that this effect pops up pretty consistently across cultures, across different educational systems even.
And you mentioned PISA before, which is, this huge international study. What does PISA tell us about the BFLPE?
Well, PISA has been running for quite a while now, collecting data on, like I said, hundreds of thousands of 15-year-old students from all around the world. And in almost every single country they looked at, they found the same pattern. The higher the average achievement level of the school, the lower the average academic self-concept of the students in that school.
It's like this negative correlation. As one goes up, the other goes down.
Exactly.
So given that this effect is so widespread, it makes sense that researchers would start looking for things that might influence how strongly it affects different students. And this is where the idea of moderators comes in.
Right. A moderator is essentially a variable that changes the relationship between two other variables. So in this case, we're asking, is there anything that makes the BFLPE stronger or weaker for certain students?
So, like, if you have a certain personality trait or a certain learning style, does that change how much the BFLPE affects you?
Exactly. Now, there are a couple of reasons why finding these moderators is really important. First, it helps us understand the underlying mechanisms, like why does the BFLPE happen in the first place? If we can find things that consistently change the effect, that gives us clues about what's really going on. Second, it has implications for interventions. If we know who's most vulnerable to the negative impacts of the BFLPE, maybe we can develop strategies to help those students.
It's like finding a pressure point. You push here and it changes something over there.
Right. Now, one of the early ideas about a potential moderator was this thing called the bright student hypothesis. Have you heard of that one?
I have vaguely. It's the idea that maybe the very top students, the superstars, are somehow immune to the BFLPE, right?
Yeah, that's the gist of it.
Yeah.
The thinking was that for these top performers, being in a high-achieving environment would still be a net positive for their self-confidence. They're still standing out, even amongst other really bright kids.
Which intuitively that makes sense, right? If you're the valedictorian, it shouldn't matter if the rest of the class is really smart too. You're still number one.
That's the logic. But the interesting thing is that the actual theory behind the BFLPE, it predicts the opposite. It says that the effect should be pretty much the same for everyone within a given classroom. It's the average achievement level of the class that sets the standard for everyone.
So even the valedictorian is still comparing themselves to that really high average.
Exactly. So a number of researchers have looked for interactions between a school's average achievement and a student's individual achievement. And they're generally not finding these huge interactions that would support the bright student hypothesis. And when they do find them, they're not always in the direction you'd expect.
So the data doesn't really back up that intuition about superstars being immune.
Right.
Now, this brings us to the study we're focusing on today, and it looks like they really drill down into a whole bunch of other potential moderators, specifically focusing on motivation. But before we get to that, were there any other studies that explored similar factors like personality traits or anything like that?
Yeah, there have been quite a few. One that comes to mind is a really comprehensive study by Seaton and his colleagues back in 2010. They used a massive data set from PISA, and they looked at a whole bunch of potential moderators. They looked at things like socioeconomic status, individual ability level, different types of motivation, learning strategies, anxiety about math, how students perceived their school environment. They threw the whole kitchen sink at it.
Wow, that's thorough.
It was. And surprisingly, they didn't find any substantial moderators of the BFLPE, at least when it came to math self-concept. They did find some statistically significant interactions just because their sample size was so big, but these didn't really change the overall finding that the BFLPE was happening pretty much across the board.
So all those factors, and they didn't really budge the effect.
Not in a meaningful way, no.
Wow. Okay, so was there any other research that suggested maybe personality traits played a role?
There was some interesting work by Jonkman and colleagues in 2012. They looked at the big five personality traits, openness, conscientiousness, that kind of thing. And they also looked at narcissism.
Narcissism.
Yep. And they actually did find some small moderation effects for neuroticism and narcissism.
So what, like if you're really neurotic, the BFLPE hits you harder?
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
Students high in neuroticism tended to experience a stronger BFLPE. And the opposite was true for narcissism. Students high in narcissism tended to have a slightly weaker BFLPE.
So maybe the narcissists are just better at ignoring the social comparisons.
That's one possible explanation. But even for those students, the BFLPE was still there. It was just a bit weaker. And as the researchers themselves pointed out, trying to make everyone more narcissistic probably isn't the solution.
No, that's probably not a good idea. Okay, so that sets the stage for the current study. And it sounds like they were really trying to zero in on this idea of motivation and how it relates to the BFLPE.
Exactly. There was a call to action from some researchers, Dye and Wren, back in 2008. They argued that we needed to move beyond simply describing the BFLPE and start digging deeper into how individual differences in motivation might be playing a role.
Because students aren't just passive sponges, right? They come to the classroom with their own goals, their own ways of thinking about learning.
Right. And this current study took that challenge seriously. They focused specifically on a whole range of achievement motivation constructs.
So What were some of the specific motivational factors they looked at?
Okay, so they drew a lot from the OECD's Students' Approaches to Learning instrument, which is a big international survey that looks at, well, students' approaches to learning. And they also looked at achievement goal theory, which is a whole theoretical framework about how students' goals influence their motivation and behavior.
Okay, so whether students want to learn for the sake of learning or if they're more focused on getting good grades?
Exactly. So they looked at task values, which is about how important, interesting, or useful students find the subject matter to be. They looked at different achievement goals, like mastery goals, which are about developing competence and understanding, performance approach goals, which are about outperforming others, and performance avoidance goals, which are about avoiding looking bad compared to others. They also looked at students' implicit theories of intelligence, which is about whether they believe intelligence is fixed or malleable. And then they looked at self-regulated learning strategies, things like how students plan and monitor their learning, how much effort they put in, how they use different strategies to understand information. And then they even looked at social interdependence theory, which is about whether students prefer competitive or cooperative learning environments.
Wow, that's a lot of ground to cover. So they were really trying to get a comprehensive picture of how motivation might be interacting with the BFLPE. And you mentioned before that they use this really systematic approach to making predictions.
Yes, the theory integrating approach, which is a fancy way of saying they got a bunch of experts together and made them argue about it.
Well, hopefully not argue.
Maybe a little. But it was all very civil and productive, I assure you.
Hmm.
So basically, they got together these experts, who are all co-authors of the study, by the way, and they each independently made predictions about how these motivational factors would affect the BFLPE.
So, I think students with strong mastery goals will experience a weaker BFLPE, and here's why.
Exactly. And then they had to share their predictions and their reasoning with each other. And then they went through several rounds of feedback and revision, trying to either come to a consensus or at least identify where the major disagreements were.
So it was a way to try to move beyond individual biases
Mhm.
and really see what the different theoretical perspectives would suggest.
Precise.
Okay, so we have these predictions based on motivation theory, and then we also have what we already know from previous BFL-PE research, which hasn't found strong evidence for individual moderators, right? And then you also mentioned this Darwinian economic perspective. Where does that fit in?
Right. So this Darwinian economic perspective is based on the work of an economist named Robert Frank, who's written a couple of really interesting books about how evolutionary principles can help us understand economic behavior.
Okay, so how does evolution tie into all of this?
Well, Frank's argument is that this tendency to compare ourselves to others, it's not just some random quirk of human psychology. It's deeply rooted in our evolutionary history. From an evolutionary standpoint, what really matters for survival and reproductive success isn't about being the absolute best in the world, but rather about being able to compete effectively within your own local group.
So it's less about being the best and more about being better than the people around you.
Exactly. And Frank argues that this constant social comparison, this drive to assess our standing relative to others, it's been shaped by natural selection over millions of years.
It's like it's baked into our DNA.
In a way, yes. And he points to research showing that this kind of social comparison happens in all sorts of domains, not just academics. People's happiness and well-being are often more influenced by how they compare to their peers than by their objective circumstances.
So even if you're objectively doing well, if everyone around you is doing better, you might still feel bad about yourself.
Exactly. And this actually ties in really well with a classic theory in psychology called social comparison theory, which was proposed by Leon Festinger back in 1954.
So this idea of social comparison is pretty well established in psychology as well.
It is, and it's one of the core mechanisms that explains the BFLPE.
So when we put all of this together, the previous BFLPE research, this Darwinian economic perspective, and the fact that social comparison is so fundamental to human nature, it suggests that maybe those individual differences in motivation won't actually have a huge impact on the BFLTE.
That was the prediction, yes.
And what did the study actually find? Did they find support for the motivation-based predictions, or did the data lean more toward this idea that social comparison trumps all?
Well, the main finding of the study was pretty clear-cut. None of the 13 achievement motivation constructs they tested showed a statistically significant moderation of the BFLPE.
Wow, so all those different flavors of motivation, and none of them really made a difference.
Nope. The negative relationship between the school's average achievement and the student's academic self-concept remains significant, even after controlling for all these motivational factors.
So it's like that Darwinian economic perspective was right on the money. This drive to compare ourselves to others is so powerful it seems to override those more nuanced individual differences.
That's the interpretation, yes. Now, they did find that when they statistically controlled for some motivational factors that were highly correlated with each other, like interest and perceived usefulness of the subject matter, it did slightly reduce the size of the BFLPE.
So there was a little wiggle room, but not much.
Right. But the core effect was still there. And importantly, they also didn't find support for the bright student hypothesis.
So even the superstars aren't immune to the pull of social comparison.
Apparently not.
Okay, so let's circle back to this Darwinian economic perspective. You mentioned Robert Frank and his work. Can you unpack that for us a bit more?
Sure. So Frank's argument is essentially that we humans are wired to compare ourselves to others because, from an evolutionary standpoint, that's what really mattered for survival and reproductive success. It wasn't about being the absolute best. It was about being better than your rivals in your immediate social group.
So it's like a local competition, not a global one.
Exactly. And this makes sense when you think about how evolution works. Natural selection favors traits that increase an organism's chances of surviving and passing on its genes. And in many cases, that means outcompeting your rivals for resources like food, mates, shelter.
So if you're constantly comparing yourself to others, you're more likely to notice when you're falling behind, and that might motivate you to step up your game.
Right. And Frank argues that this drive to compare ourselves, it's so deeply ingrained that it affects us even in modern society, where survival isn't so directly tied to those kinds of competitions.
So even though we're not fighting for our lives in the same way, we're still wired to play this comparison game.
It seems that way. And this has implications for how we understand all sorts of things, not just the BFLPE.
Yeah.
It helps explain why people might feel unhappy, even if they're objectively well off, as long as they perceive themselves as doing worse than their peers.
Right. It's all relative.
Exactly.
So this Darwinian economic perspective really adds another layer to our understanding of the BFLPE. It suggests that this isn't just some random psychological quirk. It's a deeply ingrained, evolutionarily adaptive trait that's probably not going to be easily changed by individual intervention.
That's the takeaway, yes.
Okay, so what are some of the broader implications of all this, especially when we think about how we structure our education systems?
Well, the BFLPE research in general suggests that putting all the high-achieving kids together in selective environments might have some unintended consequences.
Mm.
It might actually be undermining their self-confidence without necessarily boosting their actual performance.
So those specialized schools for gifted kids, they might not be the academic wonderlands we think they are.
They might be great for some students, but we need to be mindful of the potential downsides of these highly competitive environments. And there's other research out there suggesting that this kind of ability grouping, or tracking, within schools can actually be harmful for students overall. It can lead to widening achievement gaps, and it can also reinforce stereotypes and biases.
So we might be inadvertently creating these systems that actually make things worse for everyone involved.
That's a concern, yes. Now, it's important to note that this specific study we've been discussing didn't find that individual motivation acted as a strong moderator of the BFLPE. But there is evidence that factors at a broader level, like the way a school system groups students by ability, do seem to influence the strength of the effect.
So while we might not be able to change individual students' tendencies to compare themselves, we might be able to tweak the systems to make them less comparison-driven.
Right. And there's a whole other discussion to be had about the ethics of these kinds of systems.
Yeah.
Even if we could somehow eliminate the negative psychological effects of social comparison. Is it fair or just to create these highly stratified educational systems? That's a question for another deep dive, I think.
Absolutely. Now, you also mentioned something called jingle-jangle fallacies earlier. What are those, and how do they relate to this study?
Ah, yes. So jingle-jangle fallacies is a term that's used to describe situations where we might be mistakenly thinking that two things are different when they're actually the same. That's the jingle fallacy. Or we might be thinking that two things are the same when they're actually different. That's the jangle fallacy.
So, like, if we use different labels for the same thing, or if we use the same label for different things.
Exactly. And in this study, the researchers found that some of the motivation constructs they were looking at were pretty highly correlated with each other. So it raises the question of whether these different motivational factors are really as distinct as we think they are, or if they're actually measuring similar underlying constructs.
So even though we have all these different labels for different aspects of motivation, they might actually be overlapping quite a bit.
Right. And this is something to keep in mind when we're interpreting research on motivation in general. We need to be careful not to assume that just because we have different labels for things, those things are actually different.
It's like the old saying, if it looks like a duck, swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck.
It might just be a really weird goose.
It's Okay, last but not least, you mentioned that the strength of the BFLPE seems to be related to how strongly a certain characteristic, like self-concept or a specific type of motivation, is typically linked to academic achievement. Can you flesh that out for us a bit?
Sure. So the idea is that if a certain trait, like, say, intrinsic motivation, is really strongly associated with how well students typically perform academically, then the BFLPE is likely to be stronger for that trait. Basically, if a characteristic is really important for academic success, then social comparisons are going to matter more for that characteristic.
So it's like the stakes are higher, so the comparisons become more intense.
Right. And on the flip side, if a characteristic isn't very closely tied to academic achievement, then social comparisons in terms of achievement aren't going to have as much of an impact on that characteristic.
Okay, so let's bring it all home for our listeners. What's the main takeaway from our deep dive into the big fish, little pond effect and the role of motivation?
I'd say the key message is that the BFLPE is a very real and robust phenomenon. It's not just a fluke, and it's not easily changed by individual differences in motivation. This suggests that social comparison is a fundamental aspect of human nature, and it's something we need to be aware of, especially when we're designing educational systems and thinking about how to foster a healthy sense of academic self-concept in students.
So even though we might want to believe that we're all individuals, that we're driven by our own internal goals and values, the reality is that we're also deeply influenced by how we compare to the people around us. And this can have both positive and negative consequences.
Exactly.
So here's something for everyone to ponder as you go about your day. Think about the different ponds you swim in your workplace, your social circles, your online communities. How might the relative abilities and achievements of the people around you be shaping your own perceptions of yourself, your own sense of competence and worth?
It's something to be mindful of for sure.
It is, and maybe, just maybe, if we can become more aware of this tendency to compare ourselves to others, we can start to shift our focus more toward our own personal growth and less toward those external benchmarks. We can focus on being the best versions of ourselves, regardless of what pond we happen to be swimming in. And who knows, maybe we can even start to create ponds that are more supportive and less competitive, where everyone can thrive. That's something worth striving for. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.